in my family, I was the only PWS. So I think I never met a PWS until I met a friend in university that appeared to be also a PWS, but a mild one. So as so I think I developed a stutter at around age 5 or 6 when I changed from a small school in which I was to a big one. And for some reason, I don't know it, I began to stutter. At, so as soon as the people in my college, uh, so I mean on school, like my friends and teachers, as soon as they saw that there was something wrong with my speech, they called my family, and then they had a meeting with me, my family, and the school psychologist, who also appeared to be an SLP. And this person tried to help me with some therapy, but after a few months, she saw that she wasn't able to help me. But she knew of a good place, of a well-known place here in Spain that might be able to help me. And fortunately, it was close to my school. So I went there at around the age of 6, and I stayed in that um, in that place for around 10 years. I went to speech therapy until the age of 16, approximately. Unfortunately, they were not able to to try to get rid of my speech issue, and I continued stuttering for most of my life. I always found that speech therapy, that speech approach, to be quite useless, and or I think that also, or I think that a factor that also made it useless was that I I knew or I believed that the exercises that we were doing were not useful. The only thing I found that helped me improve my speech was the books, to try to read aloud as much as I could, which I did. Then a few years later, when I was around my teens, my speech got worse and worse. Why? Well, at those ages, as you know, I mean, we have more fears, anxiety, inferiority complexes. But I have always been a very stubborn and determined. So I think that's a reason why I became such a severe case. I mean, I used to get stuck on words with very intense and long blocks, face contortions, and so on. So if I got stuck on a word, I would force it until the end. No, and I didn't care if I had to force it for 5 seconds or 10 or 50. I would say that word. And I think that was a factor that made me become a very severe PWS. Because I think if I had stopped forcing those words and stopped speaking, I think that I would have been much. I mean, I don't think I would have been such a severe case. But so as a teen, the only things that were in my mind were the fears of speaking, were all these worries about speaking, about what people might think about myself, about my speech. And at school, I think that, well, no, I know that in some days I was even unable to try to study because I was always thinking about my stutter. I wasn't able to concentrate on things that I had to work on for school. Then At around the age of 16 or so, I decided to stop going to speech therapy because I found it as a waste of time for myself and for my family that they were wasting their savings. So I said that and I decided to stop going there. And every year, I think that once or twice a year, I used to go to the internet, to Google, and search something like stop stuttering or solution to stuttering or cure for stuttering or something like that. But unfortunately, I never found a solution. The only thing I found were some kind of websites or forums in which some people were were in which some people just spoke about their situation or about their issues with their speech, and some people even made some posts with with some with some that were extremely negative, and and all this information, it made me feel even more miserable. And from then on, I decided to never ever go again to one of those websites. Then um, then I went to university, and I saw this as a chance to try to have a change in my life, to make new friends, to start from zero. And that's exactly what I did. I made new friends, and this helped me a lot with my fluency. I mean, I still had a lot of blocks and so on, but my speech improved a little bit. And I learned also to be less worried about my speech and what people might think about my speech, which also helped, of course. At the age of 18 or 19, my family again insisted on me on going to speech therapy and to give this one last chance. Since they were so insistent, I said, fine, okay. And I went to speech therapy for a few years, but I went to a different place. So in this new place, my SLP was a few years older than me, and and in our sessions we did the same things, which were something like to try to speak, to have conversations, and she said that I used to have more issues with words that started with P's and T's and other letters that I now don't remember. So a thing that she asked me to do was to read as to say as uh, to say words that started with these letters. I don't think this was something good for me. I think that this actually made it worse. But anyway, uh, at this point, she one day she asked me if I wanted to be her guest because she had been invited to some sort of meeting on or conference for people who work with PWS, like SLPs, psychologists, doctors, and so on. And I said yes. So I went there. In that room, there were around 40 people or 30 people or so. And I was surprised to be the only PWS in that room. The rest, as I said, were psychologists, doctors, SLPs, of course. And in that meeting, the host was a doctor or something like that. And she gave a talk about a research that she made with some scans of the brain. And in those slides that showed, she showed um, she showed two pictures of the brain of a PWS and the brain of someone who speaks fluently. And she showed some parts of the brain who were darker or lighter in the PWS brain. And she said that over there, in our case, there was a gland or something like that that made a hormone, and that gland, it made a lack or an excess of that hormone. And she said that's the cause our speech, of our speech not being fluent. So she said that the solution was to have surgery on that part of the brain, which was at the center, at the exact center of the brain. So I was like, what the hell have I just heard? This doesn't make any sense. And at that point, I reached the conclusion that that these people, or there is no one here on this world who knows anything about stuttering. They just have their ideas, but they don't make sense. So yeah, and of course I spoke about this with my SLP, and she said like, well, that was a strange speech, that with some very strange, yeah, with all this about the surgery, the brain, the hormones, and all those things. A few months later, my SLP, she said that she found a device such as the one that I have, that she said it's quite an innovation for the PWS, because they said that this can help them stop stuttering. And this thing, it did something like to echo the voice of the PWS when they speak, and also the voice of the people that this thing hears. So it played again the voices and it played it at a different pitch or something like that. So if I spoke with that thing on, I would be hearing myself at my own voice, and at the same time at a higher pitch or lower pitch. So it was almost, well, and so this made you focus a lot on trying to understand what you were saying and what people were saying, that you forgot about your fears, your stutters, and you were able to speak fluently. But this worked for a few days until my brain got used to this thing, and that it became something useless. So fortunately, I did not buy that device because it was also extremely expensive. Then at the same time, more or less, when I was in college, I met a guy named Jorge in Spanish, and he and I became quite good friends. And a few weeks since the moment that we met, he said that he saw that I had some issues with my speech, and that he also had the same ones. And I was like, that's not true, because I've never heard you had a block or so. And he said, well, yes, I mean, my case is much milder, and I only stutter when I'm really nervous and so on. It's like, okay, fine. Then I finished my studies in university. I spent a few months in London to improve my English, then went back to Spain. And Jorge, or George, he went to the USA to find a job. Then I found a job. I worked with my uncle. We started a business about import and export of fish. And a few years later, I ended up being the manager of that business. So I was in charge of the sales, accounting, finance, etc. So as you can imagine, I had to make a lot of phone calls, video calls, meetings. So as you can imagine, I had a lot of bad incidents every single day. But the thing that I learned is to care less about my speech because I had to get my work done. So, so although I had a lot of bad incidents, I think that my speech improved a little bit because I learned to care less about my speech. And I worked there for around 6 years until I left that job and I went to work at my own real estate agency. And at that time, or maybe a few months before I did that, I went to take my dogs for a walk on a Sunday, and I met a guy who was doing the same thing, and we chat for a while, and he said something like, "Hey, I know that. Well, I can see that you have some kind of issues with your speech, and I think I can be of some help, and I would like to try a few things as some kind of investigation or something like that. So I won't charge you um, for these things. So if you want, I can try to help you." And I said, "Okay." And then he in, he in, he introduced me to something called the Tomatis method, Tomatis. Here, he showed me a device similar to a headset, right, like this one's over here, which and this thing did play music, and at the same time, this headset had um, so so this headset played music at a slightly different frequency, and that affected your brain somehow. And I think it improved my speech a bit because the thing about this method was to try to get rid of all the anger and all those feelings, and I can say that in that aspect this thing worked, and because of that it improved a bit my speech, but that was all. Then Jorge, my friend from college, he said that he found a book on internet from the author Lee Lovett, and that this book was helping him a lot and that I should buy it now. And I was saying, "Okay, Jorge, but I don't know because I've gone to speech therapy all my life. I don't think if this will work or not." And Jorge insisted, "Buy it how you want. You have to buy it." And that's exactly what I did. And from the first moment I got Lee's book, I saw that this book made a lot of sense. Everything that he said, the way he explained what um, and the things that and how he explained his book, how he explained what happens when we stutter and what happens in our minds and so on, that I think that the book by itself, it improved my speech like more than all those years of speech therapy. Then I sent an email to Lee and I asked him for help to finish the job and to stop stuttering. And he accepted, and we spoke like once a week for months, for exactly 8 months. I stopped, and then I became a PWSS. Of course, like all PWSS, I still had lots of fears, but I knew how to avoid them from becoming bad incidents, of course. And and I continued working on my speech. I continued to try to fight my fears and so on. And a few months later, I got an email from Lee and asking me if I wanted to be a coach, just like him and to try to help other people to stop stuttering, which of course I said yes. And well, and then a few months later, Gil and Ken, with the help of Lee, they launched SAC, and you know the rest, of course.